It can perhaps be a little unsettling, but equally illuminating and necessary to occasionally sit with the observation that in spite of having more comfort, more entertainment, more access to information and connection than any generation in recorded history, a growing and significant portion of people in the modern world report feeling, at their core, fundamentally empty. You may have felt it yourself. Everything seems fine on paper. You have entertainment. You have food. You have access to more information than any generation before you. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments, something feels missing. And the strange part is that many people cannot even explain what that missing thing is. This isn't simply sadness or grief or the ordinary fluctuation of mood that characterizes any human life. Researchers describe it as something closer to what psychologist Viktor Frankl, writing in the aftermath of the Second World War, called the existential vacuum, a condition in which the will to meaning, which he regarded as the primary motivational force in human psychology, has been thoroughly frustrated, leaving behind a kind of inner silence that no external circumstance seems particularly capable of filling. Of course, we aren't entirely without explanation. Researchers have studied this for years, and the conclusion is surprisingly consistent. Modern life may be fundamentally mismatched with the way the human brain evolved. Across psychology, neuroscience, and social science, researchers keep arriving at the same uncomfortable observation. The environment we have built is very different from the environment our minds were designed for. One that points not to any individual failing or personal weakness, but to a kind of structural mismatch between the environment that modern society has constructed and the psychological architecture that human beings actually have. One that was shaped across hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that bear almost no resemblance to the world that exists today. The psychologist Philip Brickman and his colleague Donald Campbell identified one significant piece of this mismatch as early as 1971 in a concept they termed hedonic adaptation, sometimes referred to informally as the Hedonic Treadmill, which describes the well-documented tendency for human beings to return to a relatively stable baseline of subjective well-being, regardless of what external improvements or acquisitions have occurred in their lives. The implications of hedonic adaptation are, when examined carefully, somewhat staggering. It means that the fundamental strategy most people are implicitly operating on, the assumption that acquiring more, achieving more, or improving circumstances will produce a lasting increase in satisfaction, is not merely occasionally unsuccessful, but is rather constitutively arranged to produce the same result it always has, which is a brief elevation in mode followed by a return to wherever one started, often accompanied by a recalibrated set of desires, pointing toward a larger or different version of the same thing. This is not a flaw in any particular person's psychology. It appears rather to be a general feature of how human reward systems function. The neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp described the brain-seeking system as a structure oriented perpetually toward anticipated reward rather than toward the reward itself, which helps explain why the arrival of something desired so rarely delivers what the anticipation of it seemed to promise. Think about the last thing you desperately wanted: a new phone, a promotion, a relationship, a purchase you were convinced would make you happier. For a moment it felt exciting, but how long did that feeling actually last? Days? Weeks? Perhaps even less. And then the mind quietly moved on to the next target. What makes this more acute in the contemporary moment is the degree to which the entire architecture of modern commercial life has been designed, with considerable sophistication and deliberate precision, to exploit exactly this feature of human cognition. Marketing systems, recommendation algorithms, and the structure of consumer culture as a whole are not merely responding to human desires. They are actively and continuously reconfiguring them, ensuring that the goalpost is always moved fractionally before it can be reached, and that the experience of wanting is always slightly more intense and more available than the experience of having. In this environment, the hedonic treadmill doesn't simply run on its own. It is in effect accelerated. However, the erosion of stable meaning in modern life isn't reducible to consumerism alone. Frankl argued that human beings have a genuine need not merely for pleasant experiences, but for a sense that their existence is directed towards something, that there is a reason, however modest or expansive, for the particular life being lived. Traditional cultures address this need through shared narratives, communal identity, and structured systems of value that, whatever their other limitations, provided something functioning as an answer to the question of what one was for. The gradual dissolution of these frameworks through secularization, urbanization, and the fragmentation of community into increasingly isolated units of individual experience has left a gap that consumer entertainment and digital media have rushed to fill, though by most accounts not particularly successfully. Social media presents perhaps the most concentrated version of this problem. The platforms that now structure much of daily human communication were not designed with psychological well-being in mind, and the evidence increasingly suggests that their design actively works against it. Rather than providing genuine connection, which research consistently shows requires depth, reciprocity, and a degree of sustained vulnerability, social media offers instead a simulation of connection, one that is optimized not for the satisfaction of any individual user, but for the maximization of engagement. Most people do not leave social media feeling fulfilled. They leave feeling restless, as if they consume something without being nourished by it. The mind remains stimulated, but the deeper parts of the self remain untouched. A metric that correlates quite strongly with negative emotional states, including envy, anxiety, and the particular variety of restless dissatisfaction that arises from continuous comparison with carefully curated representations of other people's lives. The neuroscience here is worth pausing on. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most commonly associated in popular accounts with pleasure, is more precisely understood by researchers as a molecule associated with the anticipation and pursuit of reward, rather than with the experience of reward itself. The psychologist Kent Berridge, working across several decades of research into what he termed wanting versus liking, demonstrated that these are neurologically distinct processes, and that wanting can persist and can in fact intensify, even when liking has been significantly diminished or entirely removed. This means it is entirely possible for a person to be caught in a cycle of compulsive pursuit of something delivering no genuine satisfaction, not because they are irrational, but because the neurological systems driving pursuit and those registering fulfillment are simply different systems, and the former can run independently of the latter. Doom scrolling, to take the most visible contemporary example. You've probably done this before. You pick up your phone for a few minutes, one video becomes 10 becomes 30, an hour disappears, and when you finally put the phone down, you feel strangely worse than when you started. Appears to operate on precisely this mechanism. Studies conducted across multiple countries have found that extended consumption of algorithmically curated negative content predicts elevated levels of anxiety, depression, and what researchers have begun calling existential worry, alongside measurable reductions in life satisfaction and a sense of coherence in one's life as a whole. Of course, the more significant observation isn't simply that such behavior is unpleasant. It is that a person can spend hours engaged in it while feeling something that functions superficially like stimulation or engagement, and yet arrive at the end of that time feeling more depleted, more hollow, and less certain of who or what they are than when they started. The question of identity is not incidental to the experience of emptiness. Contemporary psychology has increasingly recognized that a coherent sense of self, not a rigid or defensive one, but a relatively stable one, is a prerequisite for the kind of engagement with life that generates genuine meaning. When the environment in which identity forms is structured around continuous performance for an audience, constant comparison with idealized representations of others, and a feedback system based on numerical metrics of approval, the self that emerges tends to resemble a hypothesis requiring constant external verification rather than a settled fact that one simply inhabits. This is an inherently unstable arrangement, and it is perhaps not surprising that the populations most deeply embedded in these structures also report the highest rates of what researchers have begun calling psychological emptiness, defined in clinical literature as a compound experience encompassing nothingness, detachment, anhedonia, and a pervasive sense of purposelessness. Frankl, whose observations were formed in circumstances so extreme as to make any ordinary comparison seem almost impertinent, nonetheless arrived at conclusions that hold across a remarkable range of conditions. He observed that human beings can endure almost any what if they have a sufficient why, and conversely, that without a sense of why, even abundance can be experienced as a form of suffering. The contemporary evidence is beginning to suggest he was substantially correct. Populations in materially wealthy societies, particularly those most thoroughly integrated into the attention economy, report meaning deficits that research in neuroscience suggests activate some of the same neural pathways as physical pain. This isn't a metaphor. The absence of meaning appears in a measurable and neurologically legible sense to hurt. However, understanding the mechanism doesn't automatically resolve the condition, and it would perhaps be a mistake to suggest otherwise. What the research does consistently indicate is that the experiences most reliably associated with the sense of meaning and reduced psychological emptiness, genuine social connection, purposeful activity, engagement in something extending beyond oneself, and a degree of present moment awareness not continuously mediated by a screen, are precisely the experiences that modern life is structurally arranged to crowd out, deprioritize, and replace with more measurable and more commercially productive substitutes. The philosopher and sociologist Hartmut Rosa described this as alienation produced not by deprivation, but by acceleration, a state in which life moves too quickly for any genuine relationship with people, places, or activities to consolidate, and in which the self, accordingly, begins to feel like something of a stranger to itself. There are, of course, ongoing discussions in both philosophy and cognitive science. Perhaps the emptiness so many people feel today is not evidence that something is wrong with them. Perhaps it is evidence that something is wrong with the environment they are trying to live inside. Human beings were not designed for endless stimulation. They were designed for meaning, for purpose, for connection, for belonging, and maybe that is why so many people feel exhausted despite having more than ever before. Because deep down, the things we truly need cannot be purchased, downloaded, streamed, or endlessly scrolled. They have to be lived, and perhaps recognizing that is where the journey back begins. If you enjoyed this exploration into psychology, meaning, and the hidden patterns shaping modern life, subscribe for more.